Uh, Boy, just when you think things can't get more interesting or complicated or whatever you want to call it, obviously the president and Melania being diagnosed and a number of people around them, that's added a whole nother dimension to a lot of things. And we will be praying for them, obviously, to heal up, along with others that are afflicted with the COVID virus during worship. But today the theme, responsibility for future generations. You'll see some very interesting insights that I'll be sharing from Bonhoeffer that relate to, I think, relate to our situation in some very challenging ways, I guess I would say it. I just want to repeat, so welcome to this. The session will be recorded, the full session, so just so you're aware of that. Don't hold back, but the full session is being recorded. And then outlines, if you haven't noticed already, I noticed you could even click for the outline on the worship and education email we get this time. But if that doesn't work for you, you can always go right to the homepage of the website. It's down in that right-hand corner, and session 4 is there. At least when I checked it this week, it was there. Other sessions are there. There's recordings of other sessions too. So that's all available on the homepage of the website. You'll notice the priming the pump question. And again, if we were in small groups, we're not going to break into small groups, but this is the question I would have you ponder as we begin. When you think about the future the children of St. Andrew face, or you may think of your own children, your grandchildren too, and great-great-grandchildren, those who will come after you, what fills you with foreboding? And when I was first planning for this, the basic structure of this, I was actually planning back just before I think the pandemic was getting going. So and obviously things have, there's been plenty happening this in the last few months that could fill us with foreboding. But some of those things, they were going to be there anyway. Certainly the stuff with climate change and that is before us. Racial justice issues, political divisions, all those things were there. It's just something like the pandemic tends to heighten some of these things and heighten our awareness of them. So I'm drawing, in terms of what I'm drawing on from Bonhoeffer for this particular session, there's an essay he wrote called After 10 Years. It's included in Letters and Papers from Prison, which is a collection of this letters and papers from his last couple years of life when he was in prison. This was written a few months before he was arrested. So he was arrested on April 5th, 1943. This was written at Christmas time, 1942. And it was written for his fellow conspirators. So this isn't something he could just put out to the church and get everybody reading it. Not at that time, but his fellow conspirators looked to him. He wasn't the main leader of the conspiracy. So we need to, sometimes we think of Bonhoeffer as like he's the leader. He wasn't the Martin Luther King Jr. of the conspiracy. I mean, he was not the leader in that way, but his fellow conspirators certainly looked to him for reflection and pondering the meaning of what they were involved in. And so and he wanted to write, and this, when he says after 10 years, Hitler had come to power in 1933, early in 1933, this is almost 10 years then after that. So that's what he's doing. Where are we after 10 years? It's addressed to Eberhard Bethge, who was a student of his seminary, a confessing partner, and they would, confessing in the sense, confess their sins to one another. That was part of the seminary education when Bonhoeffer was leading this illegal seminary. And Bethge had become a dear friend to him also. And Bethge was part of this. Hans von Dohnanyi was his brother-in-law. In many ways, Hans von Dohnanyi was the mastermind of the conspiracy. And then Hans Oster, who was the chief of the central section of the military intelligence office. So this is the military connection. There were some other military leaders that were part of this. They had to help Bonhoeffer become a spy. That's what Bonhoeffer was. I mentioned that last week. Became a spy so that And that was his particular role, was communicating with church leaders, through church leaders with allied leaders. That was what they looked to him to do, because Bonhoeffer had been part of the ecumenical movement, so it wasn't completely unusual for him to travel. Although I find it surprising that the Nazis let him travel and let him back into the country and all that, but they did. So, so as I mentioned, this After 10 Years is included as a prologue to Letters and Papers from Prison, even though it wasn't written in prison. It bridges the gap then between the final months of freedom and his imprisonment. And it's meant to be, as I call it, it's at Christmas time, but it's a New Year's reflection, taking stock of the events and issues. So what does he say here? And I think it's amazing how timely this may seem to us as we go through this. One of his goals, he said, for us as conspirators is our effort is to expose what he calls the masquerade of evil. And so the Nazis were quite skilled at clothing themselves in the garb of relative historical and social justice. And a lot of what Hitler did was much appreciated by German society. Certainly the economy improved, and there were a lot of things that people were excited about what Hitler was doing. There's a scene that from June 17th, 1940 is when France surrendered to Germany. They had a major parade in Berlin after that. 2 million people's the estimate. And there's some footage of this that's in the documentary. And the people are absolutely jubilant when Hitler comes through and a car comes through that parade. They're absolutely jubilant because German pride's been restored and some good things have happened. So there is a sense of relative historical and social justice there. And you think in our time, I mean, the strongest argument I'm hearing for the reelection of President Trump is the economy, that he knows how to handle the economy. And that was certainly one of the key arguments Hitler put forth in terms of his maintenance of power there. Obviously, we're in a different situation. There weren't elections going on after Hitler came to power. The idea of having an election was gone in 6 months. But that was, again, people were looking and they were pleased with some of the things that were happening. Bonhoeffer realized he had reached the point in Nazi Germany where you have to stand firm with truthful, responsible deeds, as he says, rather than words. Bonhoeffer was actually silenced basically in 1940. So he was not allowed to write, to publish anything. He was not allowed to preach. They had muzzled him basically. And anybody that tried to speak out against the Nazis was going to be muzzled. I mean, that's just the way it was at that point. And so if you're going to do something to deal with that situation, what is the responsible deed that we're being called to carry out? He also lifts up in this essay, and something he also does in his ethics, what he calls failed attempts to stand firm. And when we call them failed attempts, it doesn't mean there isn't some truth in them, or that in some sense there's some good that can come through these failed attempts, but finally they ultimately fail. So, and I'll just identify these then. So reasonable people are confident that reason will fix all things. And we'll talk more about this, but it's amazing. Those of us who tend to be fairly reasonable just cannot understand, like, how can he do that? Or how can he say that? Or how can he get away with that? It's like we just repeat ourselves over and over again. I see news reporters do this over and over again. They think if they just identify the latest unreasonable thing that's been done, somehow that's should solve things. So reasonable people can again, reason's very important, being rational, but reasonable people, when they're up against, especially in Nazi Germany, that extreme a situation, reason isn't going to just sort that one out for everybody. Another one is fanatical people who are so sure of themselves, and they're just fanatics about pursuing a particular principle or ideal. And idealists lift up great ideals for us often, but they just can't understand it when somehow all those ideals just don't get implemented. And so they can be also then miss some of the realities that are going on in a situation. And we certainly have a number of idealists in our own context who are just can't understand why people are not operating this way. Again, we need idealists, but they often do not know how to deal with the kind of just destructive power that was at work in a context like Nazi Germany, and would also could have that, and that would be true of our situation today to some extent, and other situations too. And it's always interesting to listen to a conversation between somebody who's very idealistic and somebody who's realistic, and they'll just go back. The realistic person's trying to do this, and the idealist says, well, how can we not pursue the truth or do this? And and they'll talk right past each other at times. People of conscience. These are people that really want to do the right thing. They hope that others will do the right thing. And then they run into situations where sometimes you may be picking between two good things, or sometimes you have to make choices about two things that are kind of evil, both of them. Neither one's a good choice. This kind of thing just tears apart people of conscience. And so very difficult for somebody with a conscience to just figure out how to navigate through Nazi Germany. Just how do you do it? It's because you're not going to be able to find the right and you want to know you're doing the right thing, and it may not be clear at times. As I'm saying these things, Bonhoeffer is also reflecting, all these things are things that he struggled with himself. Finally, you get involved in an attempt to assassinate the head of state, and a guy who's responsible for a lot of evil and destructive stuff happening there. But at the same time, you're still murdering somebody. And so there's no way to do that with just a clean conscience. And we're kidding ourselves at times in times when there's a lot of shades of gray. We're kidding ourselves if we think we can just find the right answer and work through it. Dutiful people. They obey the commands of those in authority, and they think that's what their job is to obey those who are in authority. This is the excuse many Nazi soldiers gave, was they were just following orders. I was just doing what I was told. And so why am I being held responsible when I was just doing what I was told? And obviously dutiful people may, with the best of intentions, they do want to do the right thing, but they are just so easily manipulated by people with power, that know how to wield power. They're easy to manipulate in that way. And it's hard for them then to take responsibility for things when their intent was to obey. And how did this happen? That's hard for them to deal with. People of freedom. This one's a little trickier for me. I've always struggled a little bit to understand this, but where you value the necessary deed more highly than an untarnished conscience and reputation. These are people who are not afraid to make the tough decisions that need to be made, but sometimes they can kind of almost get caught up in wielding power, doing the necessary deed, and they may lose sight of another solution to something or another action that could be taken. In some ways, this may sound a little bit interesting to people, but at times this is how President Trump functions. He'll, in a given situation, he'll just do what he thinks needs to be done. And sometimes people just say, well, he's being self-centered or whatever, but there's also times where he just does what he thinks needs to be done, and he doesn't really care about what half the populace thinks about him. He just doesn't care. Bonhoeffer was also struggling with this because the conspirators, they came to the conclusion they needed to engage in what you might say was a necessary deed to stop what was happening there. And they certainly were putting their reputations at risk in doing that. But again, the possibility comes if you're too confident in your ability to do what necessarily needs to be done, you may lose sight of some other things that are going on that need to be attended to. And then the last failed attempt is the privately virtuous, where he says they just close their eyes to the injustices around them. This just is too overwhelming to deal with all of this. I'm just going to go and live out my life, and may live a very good life in terms of doing right in your own private area. This was a temptation of many of Protestant Christians, right, Catholic Christians too in Germany, but it's certainly at times as Christians in our tradition, there's been a bit of a tendency to just live our private lives and stay out of, we want to stay out of politics. Why? Because it's too messy. It's why when I was up at Trinity Lutheran in Tacoma, we had an amazing food bank. We were the go-to place, kind of like St. Matthew is here. And people contributed so generously to that. We fed so many people. This is all good, but try to get some people to go down to Olympia, to the state capitol, and lobby for laws that would help hungry people. Almost hardly get anybody to go to do that. Why? Because it's messier when you get down there. You know, changing the law, working in politics is just messier. So I want to do feed the hungry because then I know I'm doing the right thing. That's, you know, that sense of private virtuousness. And again, there's nothing wrong with feeding the hungry, obviously. But again, his whole point is none of these ways of approaching things are adequate for what needs to be done in a situation, especially when you get into an extraordinary situation where you have such destructive power that it is running the nation. So he lifts up then what he calls standing firm by engaging in responsible, truthful action. So the ultimate is not reason, principles, conscience, duty, freedom, virtue. So none of those things above, they can help us, but none of those attempts are the ultimate. And so what's needed is what he calls obedient and responsible action toward God and humans. And today we would have to include the whole creation. We have to take the whole creation and our interrelationships into account, but he was not doing that here. So Bonhoeffer critiques any approach that's focused too exclusively on consequences or motives or any one ethical factor. So our tendency is we want to grab onto something and say that, and then do the right thing based on that principle or our assessment of the ethical situation. We want to know we're doing the right thing. That's called theologically, that's called self-justification. And virtually everybody has a tendency to do it that way. We want to justify ourselves before or after the fact. And that can apply to personal issues we're dealing with, personal ethical issues or ethics in the community and so on. We want to know we're doing the right thing. And Bonhoeffer said, for better or for worse, and especially in challenging situations, we have to take into account consequences, motives, values, principles, facts, purposes. All relevant factors need to be taken into account in discerning what's the responsible action. So think of the most difficult ethical decisions you've had to make in your life. And the most difficult ones, they finally drive us if we're not willing to just accept an easy answer. And we're really trying to discern what is God calling me to do in this time and place, or what is God calling us to do. We end up having to do this because no one of these things gives us an easy answer. And so in the challenging ones, we end up looking at a variety of factors. And this is not brilliant, but tough ethical issues are tough because they're tough. That's the way it is. That's part of being a human being, is to be willing to work through those tough issues that we face. Bonhoeffer also acknowledges that we have a limited point of view in history. And so there are times when we have to choose between good and good or evil and evil. And, choosing between good and good may just be a little bit difficult to do, but that's not the tough case. The tough case is when we've got two bad choices, like murdering somebody or saving the nation. I mean, those are not, that's not a fun choice to have to make. And then we can face that in a variety of other ways. So let's go on. Stupidity is the enemy of the truth. He actually argues in this essay, it's just a one page here, but he says stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice. And it's futile, he says, to try to persuade a stupid person with reason. Reason falls on deaf ears. The facts contradicting prejudice are not believed. Irrefutable facts are pushed aside as inconsequential and incidental. And stupid persons are utterly self-satisfied and easily irritated. This was written in 1942, the end of 1942. I remember reading this again another time, and it's just stunning how insightful this is. But I want to lift up again those that if we just think that people are going to be reasonable because we're reasonable, we are missing the reality of what's going on and missing how power can be wielded. And so we really have to wake up to this if we're going to actually address the situation. So for example, right now I've been lifting this up. Pastor Robin has Eco Faith Recovery, lots of people. Voting. It isn't, the point of voting is to actually win the vote. Now, we're trying to do it with integrity also, as much as integrity as we can muster. We want to win the vote. But finally, that's what needs to happen. Again, in Nazi Germany, that wasn't an option for these conspirators at that point. But voting, that we're trying to do it, but it's about winning the vote. And we can complain, reasonable people say, well, how can people try to suppress the vote? And how can they do this? And we'll have all these things, and we say, this just isn't fair and all that. Yes, but the point right now is if you're very concerned about the leadership of the country, if you happen to be concerned about the leadership of the country and the direction it's going, right now the best opportunity is to hang in there and stick with the vote. The minute we step out of it, step out of the process, it's like we're removing ourselves from the actual situation we're in. And it's not going to be clean necessarily, but it's not going to be what's been said. We have to expose the exaggerations that have been said about how, that mail-in voting doesn't, is somehow corrupt. People in Oregon know mail-in voting works just fine. We've been doing it for years, but don't be surprised that the other 45 states that don't do mail-in voting like we do yet, there's going to be issues raised about it. And if you're in danger of losing, why wouldn't somebody that's in danger of losing, being human, they're going to complain about something. They're not going to just admit they're losing because they're losing. So what I'm saying is the voting process is just messier this time around than it's been. What we hope is that finally the people that are elected or not elected will abide by the results. Al Gore did the country a major service back in 2000 when he conceded. And he could have made a case, he could have dragged it out forever, but at that point he made a decision and he was choosing, maybe he had to make a choice between two choices, neither one which was a perfect decision, but he potentially saved us from having a real disaster. That's the challenge we have now is will the person, if President Trump is not elected, will he abide by the results? But it's not just him, will other Republican leaders abide by them? Will they help make it happen? And so he'll stand down, so to speak, at that point. But again, we may be upset with the process right now, but it's not the time to remove ourselves from it. You see, we can't expect people to all of a sudden become reasonable who are not reasonable and don't live their lives just based on reason. This can be very challenging for us. Bonhoeffer talks about stupidity not as an intellectual defect. So you're not stupid in the sense that way, but it's a human defect. And they allow this to happen to themselves. And he's talking not only about the leaders, but about the people who are easily caught up in a strong upsurge of power, political or religious. And we've seen that happen over and over again in history where people get sucked into these upsurges of power. And we can easily lose our inner independence, let ourselves be swayed by slogans, catchwords, and the like. And the problem with this is it's subject to misuse by an irresponsible or diabolical leader. So again, stupidity, don't think of it as an intellectual thing because then I don't want to be stupid, and most people are not, we're not stupid. By and large, most people are fairly intelligent. And so it's not, but it's a human defect where we allow ourselves to be used and manipulated by others. The only way to overcome stupidity, he says, is the internal liberation of human beings to live responsible lives. Like, to engage in the process, go through it, make the best decisions we can, accept the consequences, and go on to the next day. And that can be hard to do. Then the key thing I want to lift up, though, in this same essay, he says that it's important to live the truth today with an eye on the coming generation. And we never want to abandon the future to an irresponsible or diabolical opponent. To those we don't want to give in. The ultimately responsible question, Bonhoeffer writes, is how will the coming generation go on living? And then he adds a comment: the younger generations have the surest sense of whether an action is responsible or truthful because their future is at stake. Before anything happened with the COVID-19, with what we're going on, we certainly have major concerns about how the next generations are going to go on living due to climate change. And then when you get heightened political division, racial injustice, you've got 400 years of slavery in this nation. So we do need to ask, how will the next generations of people of color, how will they live in this country? And to look at that, not again, avoid the question, but embrace it. How will we deal with climate issues? And the time on that, it used to be that we could see that as something we'll need to deal with in the future. The future is coming very quickly to us. The wildfires were just a symptom of how quickly that's coming to us. And then the trust in the younger generations. My daughter Mattia, I'll tell a little story about her. This was back in 2016. It was before the Oregon presidential primary. And she said, well, Bernie Sanders was running better than people said. She said, well, Bernie Sanders is not going to beat Hillary Clinton. They're just not going to let him beat Hillary Clinton. So we're talking about the Democrats here, not the Republicans. We're talking about the Democrats. But she's not like she studies politics all the time, but she said, no, they'll never let that happen. She said, but you watch, in 20 years, we're going to be doing some of the exact things Bernie Sanders is talking about, with universal health care, dealing with the climate, some of those things. Doesn't mean the country was ready for it then, but that was her. She instinctively could see those were things that are going to have to be resolved moving forward. And it's not just going to be resolved by political leaders either. That's something we're all going to have to deal with and embrace as we go forward. Bonhoeffer asks a real haunting question: are we still of any use? And he's talking to these conspirators, and he says, we've been silent witnesses of evil deeds, so maybe we've been too quiet about all this. He acknowledges that. We've learned the arts of obfuscation and equivocation. I mean, lying, what we talked about in telling the truth. I mean, just to be a conspirator, you're constantly doing things that you never would have done in more normal times. And so we've been worn down by unbearable conflicts. Anybody feeling a little bit worn down this year? And there's a lot of things we're having to deal with and sort out. It's not surprising that these kinds of things would wear us down. And it's so important then to ask what can cultivate hope, strength, and ability to go forward in the midst of what we're going through. And then he talks about there's a need for simple, uncomplicated, and honest human beings. And he's really saying, he in many ways was a very complicated human being. And these conspirators are being involved. When you get involved in conspiracy, that's a complicated thing. But he's just recognizing the need for just solid followers of Jesus. People are willing to live out their lives with some integrity, not afraid to be engaged in the process. He's really feeling the need, and he just sees what's happened in their society and what the toll that has taken on their society and their nation. And he's very, very concerned about that. So some implications for our context, and then we'll open it up. We have not been reduced to silence in our culture. And so we are in a different situation than Nazi Germany. We still can speak out and do that. And so it's important that we take advantage of the ability, where we do have ability to speak out in many and various ways. there is a need for responsible, truthful words and deeds. It's not the time for the church to retreat into the relative security of sanctuaries, or I added online worship, because that would imply a failure to live the truth in our context. We can't just kind of bury our heads in the sand is another image we could use. A large segment of our country is caught up in a strong upsurge of political power and have been swayed by slogans, catchwords, and the like. Make America great again. By the way, catchwords can be used on every side of the political spectrum. So, but it's clearly the case that we need to also not just equivocate on all those. We need to look at each and see who more is trying to speak the truth here. Whether they're speaking it completely accurately or not, that's not the point, but what's the effort to be as clear as possible on it. Then Donald Trump's rhetoric is often irresponsible or lacking in truthfulness. He almost seems naive, or he's either naive or he's devious about the consequences of his rhetoric. Okay? So we might say, well, at times he almost seems naive, or he's really devious, and I can go back and forth on that, but that's just the truth of the matter. There's a lack of due consideration for large groups of people when he calculates what he's going to do. And that's for example, why, he did it again in the debate, where you could not use the words white supremacists and just denounce white supremacists. He just could not bring himself to do that. I don't completely get that in him, why he couldn't do that, even just to maintain a pretense, but he did not do that. And there's a lack of attentiveness with him to the full spectrum of ethical factors. He just does. And so that's why I mentioned, what does it mean to tell the truth? I'm not sure he's capable of, you'd have to have a grasp of reality to speak the truth in a given situation. At times he just seems to lack that. And the problem, it's difficulty with him is he's the president of the United States. This is not unique to Donald Trump. There are other people that have some similar characteristics to this. We do at times too, but he is the president of the United States and functioning in this way. And so he just doesn't get all the ripple effects of what he does, or he doesn't care, and that's, neither one's a good situation. Joe Biden struggles to express himself at times, puts his foot in his mouth. Whether you agreed with him or were thinking the same thing as he was, it would have been better not to say shut up to the president of the United States. I hope that didn't lose him too many votes, but again, it's about winning elections here. And so you have to be really savvy about these things. I don't think that was the comment in hindsight that he or his campaign leaders wanted to make. So he has, and then this is not new with Joe Biden, he has, occasionally he just puts his foot in his mouth, as we would say. But with Joe Biden, he does seem to have a genuine concern for future generations. And for the most part, we can critique the candidates that are presented, but Mitt Romney had a concern for future generations. John McCain did. Hillary Clinton did. Al Gore did. So all the people who lost these elections, George Bush did. This is the first president in my time where I'm concerned that he may not have that much concern for future generations. He really may not. But that's something that it's almost like a basic thing we hope for in our leaders, that they have some concern for those that are coming after them, as well as for the good of those of us who are a part of the society. So just a couple of questions, and then anything you want to mention. Who are the voices of wisdom and truthfulness in the public sphere, especially during this pandemic? And what is the responsibility of the church for future generations? Anything you want to ask about or share, comments you want to share about that, love to have you share. And raise your hand. I'll try to recognize you. If I'm missing you, just unmute and speak up. All right? Anybody want to? Jan, and then Peggy.
One thing that we're doing is trying to read, and we're kind of on the I think, reasonable spectrum. And we've been trying to read about historians of presidencies and historians of actions like this, because they tend to be fact-based as much as things can be fact-based without opinion. And kind of like what you're putting forward here is a historical look at a time that we think is similar to ours. And so we've been looking to readings and writings by historians to try to put things in a perspective that we can then make our own determinations. So that's kind of, I think, how we're trying to stay sane here.
Yeah,
We're doing, and this feeds that very well. So thank you for doing this.
you bet. No, I fully affirm. When I have heard these historians interviewed, they do tend to just be helpful in gaining some perspective on what's going on. Peggy. There we go.
I was thinking that what's kind of like opening Pandora's box, things that the way Trump behaves gives legitimacy to lying, to disorder, to all that bad behavior. He's probably not the first one to necessarily have some bad behavior that we've admired, but with the COVID and the whole history of 2020, it's not going to be the same. I think when ideas get out there, we're teaching people things that lines they might not have crossed before. Truly, it's not new for people to break things up and riot and so on, but it wasn't something that was commonly done like it is now. It's become more to the fore. What do I say? What are the things we are learning that maybe are not the best things to learn? When the president of the United States does these things, then other people think it's okay.
Yeah.
You know, so we're going to go into something where order is going to be reconfigured, or, there'll be changes. There has to be changes because we can't stay at this level of division, I think.
Well, the one thing that's certainly changed is the lack of civility, and it was already changing prior to this president. I've just noticed a lack of civility. And again, but a little bit like reasonable people, just expecting that everybody's going to be civil all the time. And they'll be civil until something that's really important to them happens and they don't know how to deal with it and they lash out and so on. But still, the lack of civility has been really exaggerated, and the level of incivility is really
well, that is you've got your finger right on one of the problems is skills, not having resources and skills to deal with things.
Yeah. Other comments? Mary, and then Luann.
And I saw Janet's hand go up too, so.
Okay,
yeah.
We'll go
Okay,
Mary,
so,
Luann, and Janet. All right.
Okay, so your question, who should we look, what are some voices of reason? I think I just lost my question, it was on the computer, but so we have Fauci, during this period, and that was, I just always felt so relieved when I heard him speak, because you felt like it was truth. And so that's in the area of health, but then you realize all of the appointed heads of whether it's the environment or energy or education, all of those secretaries are not people who know what they're talking about in those fields. They're often people who have conflicts of interest. So it would be nice to have voices of reason in all the areas, because the president can't have expertise in all those areas, but hopefully would appoint people in all those areas. So, and that I feel has been a failing for us.
Yeah. Luann?
You know, one of the things that Peggy was talking about was really respect. And what we've seen is a lack of respect. And I really think respect is power. I mean, if you can be respectful, people will respect you, and that is power. And I think that's something that our current president doesn't approach power in that way. And I cringed at the "shut up and you're a clown" Biden's comments during the debate, because I think overall he's quite respectful.
No, it's, yeah.
And you know, but you get to a point where you're so downtrodden or, you know, attacked that you lose the ability to be respectful.
Yeah. Huh. No, well stated. Janet?
Mark, when you said that it's a human thing when you're losing an election to say, well, it's because of mail-in ballots, or it's because of this, or it's because of that. I think it's true that there is a human impulse to blame it on something else besides I'm losing the election. But it's also a human thing, and there is a human thing of saying I'm losing the election. It's also a human characteristic of some humans to have more integrity and say, I'm losing the election. So I think it's good to have compassion and understand that some people react in the manner of a small child and say, it's not because I'm losing the election, it's because of something else. But let's acknowledge too that there are humans who are more grown up and say, I'm losing the election because I'm losing the election. You know, so we can't expect somebody to be what we want them to be. If they're more childish, they are. But some of us aren't, and let's be happy about that.
So thanks, Janet. In a sense, what I'm lifting up here, either implying it or just outright saying it, is that President Trump's level, it's not just, I'm not just talking intellectually here, I'm talking his emotional maturity it's not, he has a lot of room to grow in that area. And if we expect him to be emotionally mature, I think we're just kidding ourselves. And so you have to deal with the real president in front of us and ask, how do we deal with that and respond to that? And if you think he's not the guy to be in office, the best way in our system, the most peaceful way, hopefully, is to not vote for him. But we have to deal with real people in front of us, not the people we want them to be. And then we can be upset. How did he get in office? He is in office. So we have to deal with that reality. And so then, and how do we go from here? We can't go back and redo what happened before. We have to look at here. We learn from the past, but we have to operate from here. Any other, Steve? That's Steve Claiborne, all the way from, oh, you're right here, Steve. I can tell, I see the fir trees in the background.
Yeah, just down the street from you. So, I was just wondering, maybe you talked about this earlier, Mark, but it seems one of the operating approaches is this using fear, the fear of loss.
Yeah.
I was listening just by chance to a Christian broadcast message yesterday, driving from the coast, and the message was the same as yours, is think about future generations and the fear that you may have if the Democrats, the socialists, the communists were to somehow get into power. And I think that fear has been used in this last 4 years in a very effective way, a fear of loss. And I think that's a personal thing for the president as well. I think he operates from a base of fear of loss, fear of his business. And then he uses, that's a powerful tool for a lot of people who fear that they're losing something or may lose something. And that just kind of trumps rational thought. And I just wondering how Bonhoeffer might have dealt with that.
Well, interesting enough, you know, one of the geniuses, we'll call it genius of Hitler, was to help Germany appeal with their both fear and their shame and embarrassment about the Treaty of Versailles and what that did to their country. And Hitler figured that out, and boy, he could push a lot of buttons pushing on that, and utilize fear, and in some way just eventually just outright intimidation. You know, if you're putting people away in concentration camps the minute they speak out against you, I mean, you're intimidating the populace and intimidating the leaders, but the populace falls into line then. So no, clearly fear is, and interesting enough too, fear can be what drives both sides of the political spectrum times too. And it's just that it's been so blatant with what we've seen in the last few years with this president. Let me make a final comment. You know, there are concerns about the president basically has come out and in various ways said he's going to delegitimize the election. And then you see some of what's going on. You have the governor of Texas, 1 drop-in box per county. So a lot of stuff's going on. And I just want to plead one more time. It is very important, in my view, and this is one view, it is important that we do everything possible to make this a legitimate election and encourage people to participate. So we don't want to help delegitimize it by getting upset with the attempt to delegitimize it and kind of give up. So this is not the time to give up. Post-election, we may be in a whole different situation. We'll see what happens once the election happens and a decision is made. And if the election is delegitimized and that actually is able to be pulled off in some way, then we'll be in a whole nother situation. But in my view, we don't want to prematurely help delegitimize it. So keep the efforts up to vote, encourage others to vote. Thank you to Eco Faith Recovery and other groups that are doing that. And we need to keep ourselves focused here, heading towards the election, and do everything we can so it'll be very clear as possible, that if an effort's made to delegitimize it, that it really looks that it's been delegitimized. Because you know, we did everything we could to try to have a not just a fair election, but a just one. I appreciate what Eco Faith Recovery identified there in terms of a just vote, and that takes into account all sorts of factors in our voting. So we have to work from where we're at and not get ahead of ourselves. The other thing I'll say is, if somehow the election were to get delegitimized, I'm going to be much more careful in that situation about what I say. I'm not going to be leaving an electronic paper trail. We're going to have to if we end up in a situation like that, we'd have to wake up to that and adjust and not be naive about the realities of that. But it's not just, you don't just delegitimize an election just like that. That's going to take a major effort. My hope is there'll be enough public servants or people with integrity, at least some shred of integrity, that our leaders will make sure that there is a peaceful transfer of power. Even Mitch McConnell is on record as saying there will be a peaceful transfer of power. So it's important that people like him especially are saying things like that right now. Next week, so we'll talk what's at stake. I have the 10 commandments of elections, I think, or something I called it. Well, I'll share that with you. That'll be relatively short, but it'll be much more time for conversation. So what's at stake for you in this election, and for you and for community, church community you're a part of, from your point of view? That will be the focus for next week. So I won't do as much presentation. I'm not going to be talking, doing stuff from Bonhoeffer next week, other than for us to share any insights we have from what I've already shared. But what's really at stake in this election as we move toward it. All right. Thank you. We'll see you in worship, or if you've already worshiped, go in peace and have a restful Sabbath.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. Thank you so much, Pastor Brocker.